There's no way to sugarcoat or ease into this kind of topic. So instead of a fun story or situation, something to reference, something similar to my thoughts on how paladins were implemented, or trying to make a joke of some kind about it, we're just going to face facts and start out strong. Paladins, as they were implemented originally in vanilla World of Warcraft, are simply wrong. Welcome to Ancient Lore, a discussion series where we peel back the layers of world building and story to examine, understand, and discuss where we came from in the World of Warcraft. Today's topic is the original implementation of Paladins. And as always, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section below or connect with me on my Discord. This episode is going to be divisive. And I'm absolutely certain that many of you will either disagree with me or at least feel I'm off base in some fashion. That's okay. I'm perfectly fine with people feeling I'm a touch off on this, but I also want you to be open to shifting your perspective on this, and to be open on what could have been if the developers of World of Warcraft had taken the lore a bit more seriously in this regard. I also fully admit that I speculate a lot in this discussion. And if you end up disagreeing with me because of said speculation, I entirely understand. All I ask, more than anything else, is that you take the time to listen and try to understand my ideas and perspective. If you do, and you still disagree with me, I respect your thoughts and opinions, and I'm grateful for you giving me the same. The history of Paladins in the Warcraft Universe begins with, unfortunately, a tragedy. During the first war between orcs and humans, the Horde discovered their lead spy and assassin, Garona Half-Orcan, had been captured by the elite forces of Stormwind, and had imprisoned her in Northshire Abbey, a location Stormwind considered extremely safe. The information she had was invaluable for both sides, and because of that, Black Hand ordered a massive military operation to recover Garona and destroy Northshire Abbey. Both objectives accomplished, this became known as the slaughter of the clerics of Northshire, and its lasting impacts on the world are felt to this day. It's so important that we remember the aggression and violence of this act. It's gonna come up later. Fast forwarding just a year or two to the exodus of Stormwind's refugees north across the Great Sea and landing on the shores of Lordaeron. The leader of the Church of the Holy Light in Lordaeron, Archbishop Alonsus Fowl, heard the stories of the slaughter of the clerics of Northshire and was struck in a way he had never been before. These reports of unhinged aggression, death, and destruction disturbed him to such a point that he dedicated himself, along with Regent Lord Anduin Lothar, to form a new order of knights to defend the people. This order was the Silver Hand. The founding of this new branch of the Church of the Holy Light was a new concept for humanity, an order of knights dedicated to martial prowess and strength, but also healing and leading the peoples of the Alliance of Lordaeron. To quote Alonsus Fowl directly, "Some were knights before, but others were priests. I chose these men for both their piety and their martial prowess. They will be trained, not only in war, but in prayer and in healing. And in each of these valiant fighters will possess both martial and spiritual power, particularly in blessing themselves and others with the strength of the Holy Light." Alonsus Fowl also stated that these paladins should reflect the best in humanity, and should be the healers and protectors that the peoples of the nations of humanity needed. There's a lot to break down there, so let's take some bullet points and go step by step. Martial prowess and healing the people comes up many times. The ability to physically defend the peoples of humanity as well as heal and rejuvenate them. These two things, more than anything else, are the prime reason that the Order of the Silver Hand even exists, protecting the well-being of the people of Lordaeron, both in body and in soul, were the majority objectives of the Paladins. Trained in war, but also in prayer. Much like the statement on their martial prowess, the idea that the Paladins be trained in war, but also in prayer has a very specific meaning. It's very similar to the saying that one believes in peace, but but is prepared to fight for it. This talks about not just the personal physical strength needed to defend the peoples of Lordaeron, but also the moral strength and awareness to know when to set your weapon down, to have that personal restraint against unhinged aggression, a callback there, to be a stalwart defender without crossing that line into being an aggressor or destroyer, representing the best of humanity. While possibly one of the more ambiguous parts of Foul's statements, is nonetheless vital. This was the time of orcs versus humans still, as the Alliance of Lordaeron had just formed, and trying to be the polar opposite of the orcish hordes was a very important part of what the peoples of Lordaeron and the survivors of Stormwind believed in. The horde represented aggression, anger, unhinged destruction to the peoples of the Alliance, and the Paladins were made to be the best of the opposite of that: defensive, protective, strong but restrained, empowered to heal those in need, and to act selflessly instead of selfishly. Trained and empowered to fight and heal, Paladins were dedicated to embodying the idea of priests in plate, warriors of the highest capacity, trained to peak martial skill and perfection, but also trained to heal and protect. I believe I've made the points of what the Paladins were founded on remarkably clear, but let's go through their actual game mechanics in both Warcraft 2 and 3 and show how these tenets were expressed. More importantly than anything else, Paladins were exceptionally powerful healers. The ability Holy Light for both games was a very strong healing skill, and one of the primary reasons you have a Paladin in the first place. In addition, in both games, the Paladin could use the light to purge the undead. In Warcraft 2, this was a separate skill called Exorcism, and in Warcraft 3, this was built into the Holy Light ability. However, at no point in time could the Paladin use the light to harm a living being. This is a very important point that I hammer over and over again whenever this comes up. While priests and clerics actively used abilities like Holy Lance and Smite to defend themselves, offensive light magic, Paladins were barred from this. This begs the question, if Paladins were meant to be the peak warriors, strongest in the use of the light and physical prowess, why wouldn't they be taught to use the light offensively? I think the clear answer is, while they were perfectly capable of doing so, there was a restriction on Paladins from harming other living beings with the light. This reflects strongly on the ideas of restraint and acting in a defensive manner, and I think our next point also reinforces this. Weapon choice was a critical part of the storytelling in Warcraft 3, but even through Warcraft 2, Paladins used warhammers, non-bladed weapons. The act of not bearing a blade against a foe, but instead using the grounded stone of their warhammers to strike down the enemies of humanity, is an important symbol to consider for Paladins. The hammer in general is used over and over again as a symbol of the Silver Hand, even for certain abilities in World of Warcraft. The biggest part of this symbolism, however, is with Arthas himself, a one-time Paladin apprentice that forsakes his warhammer in favor of a cursed blade. Accepting aggression in the form of Frostmourne was the final betrayal of the Silver Hand's tenets that he once held so dear, and shows us how incredibly vital the belief in self-restraint is for all Paladins. A lesser point that I still want to make is the extent certain powers go and some restrictions Paladins had, even on their immense power in the Holy Light. The first, and this could easily be written off as a game mechanic restriction, is that you cannot, both in Warcraft 2 and 3, self-target with Holy Light. I fully understand why people see this as a simple game engine restriction, but if someone considers the many other spells, even some hostile, can be self-cast, it makes one wonder, why not Holy Light? My answer is, there's a restriction on members of the Silver Hand that requires them to use their powers of healing on others before themselves, a reinforcement of the selflessness that is supposed to be a hallmark of their order. Sure, this is almost purely speculation, but not all lore world building is necessarily done on purpose. Sometimes it emerges from patterns or happenstance coincidences, many times developing into key plot points or notes of world building across many different franchises. These key points show us the dividing line between a paladin and a crusader, between a patient, caring defender and healer, and a marauding destroyer filled with holy wrath. One analogy that I've used many times in this discussion, and I feel it's apt to this day, is that paladins are incredibly similar to the Jedi Knights of the Old Republic, especially when compared to the Sith. Jedi are hallmarked by being judges, protectors of peace, unimaginably powerful, but at the same time restrained, choosing to act with calm and reason as often as possible. This comparison, while obviously somewhat cliché, also feels incredibly accurate, and I hope helps people relate to my overall point. Let's get to that overall point and transition from stating facts and speculating on them to the purpose of this piece. The Paladins in World of Warcraft not only barely bear a passing resemblance to actual members of the Silver Hand, but also, and more specifically, are nowhere close to accurate in many respects. While I feel there's multiple reasons to say this, let's start off with the most true armor-plated elephant in the room. Paladins in World of Warcraft, from their first few levels to the most elite of max-level overgeared characters, all use the light to harm other living things. Not just that. It's not just weapon enhancements or passive effects, but more importantly, core abilities like judgments and unique strikes to wield the power of the light in an offensive manner. This is, in all ways, antithetical to the core tenets of the Silver Hand, and something that Paladins had never been capable or allowed to do in any of the previous RTS titles. Not only that, in a truly excessive case of blasphemy towards the tenets of the Silver Hand, an ability called Holy Shock can be used to either heal friends or harm enemies. Any enemies. Living, dead, demon, even harmless woodland animals. I think you understand where I'm going with this. I would spend more time on this point as it's a massive issue, and the core of my problems with Paladins in World of Warcraft, but even I can only repeat myself so many times. The issue is systemic, built into almost every aspect of Paladins in World of Warcraft. We'll return to this point later when I suggest some solutions. In addition, there are essentially no weapon restrictions for Paladins. Any weapons, polearms, swords, axes, and of course maces and hammers, are all viable for Paladins to use in World of Warcraft. Why did the restriction on using only hammers and maces not carry over? Certainly, many other classes experience odd or strange weapon restrictions. Take priests, for example, completely unable to use swords in any way, even caster-esque blades. Not daggers, though. Daggers are just fine. And maces. Or take shamans, for example. In vanilla, they were capable of wielding these massive two-handed weapons and dedicated themselves to dishing out melee damage, but couldn't pick up a fork and knife at the same time in each hand. And kudos if you get that reference, by the way. Weapon restrictions in vanilla, in particular, were very real and had some legit and not so legit reasons behind them. So why weren't there any put in place for Paladins, who had a very strict history of use and symbolism of hammers and mauls? It's not like there aren't a ton of options for Paladins in the one- and two-handed hammer categories, and it would have encouraged a greater variety of weapons throughout vanilla. On a more minor note, and this isn't something I feel is a sticking point, as honestly, it feels like a less meaningful restriction, but there are little to no restraints on spell usage for Paladins. For Barons is the only situation you can honestly say a restriction is imposed, which I like. You can target yourself with heals, bubble others, buff and cast without hampering yourself. This is the only point I bring up that I don't really see a reason to change anything with, as it's been implemented in World of Warcraft. As in WoW, you're already naturally encouraged to participate in groups and play well with others, so other than a few bits of flavor, I just bring this point up to be complete. In regards to restrictions, there is something that bugs me about race choices in World of Warcraft that just scratches me the wrong way. Dwarf Paladins. Before 2004, there were no documented instances of the Silver Hand accepting any members other than humans. The Silver Hand was made by design to be defenders of humanity. And while this seems like an odd sticking point, I have a very specific reason. Humans in the World of Warcraft universe are moderately xenophobic. Between the war against the orcs that dragged on for decades and their less than ideal interactions with the blood elves and trolls, they generally look down on non-humans. While I don't believe they acted antagonistically towards high elves or dwarves, for the most part, you cannot convince me that the Silver Hand let them into their order vanilla or earlier. To speculate further, I believe the choice to allow Dwarven Paladins to exist was a combination of attempting to balance the factions out, as orcs, tauren, and trolls could all be shamans, as well as trying to give dwarves another option that wouldn't force Blizzard into making Mountain Kings a class. Either way, while I don't doubt that eventually dwarves and other races would be inducted into the Order of the Silver Hand, we have no background or documentation for this happening, and as such, I dislike it excessively. Also, don't even think about bringing up Draenei quote-unquote paladins. Draenei shouldn't have happened like that, and even if they did, they were never members of the Silver Hand, so you can't call them paladins. My final gripe on paladins, as they were implemented in WoW Vanilla, was the talent trees overall. Holy, Protection, and Retribution. And going from left to right, I scale from having very few problems to having very many problems. Holy is honestly the least offensive. It offers greater faith and power in the light, and besides Holy Shock, does so much to make a paladin a stronger healer and support player. All great things. Replace Holy Shock, and we're good. Protection has a few things I take issue with, the biggest of which is Holy Shield and Blessing of Sanctuary. I should take issue with Reckoning just because of how absolutely bonkers wreck bombing someone got in Vanilla, but I really should pick my battles here wisely. I also take issue with the Holy Damage and being the primary mechanic for threat building, but I think we can all agree that in Vanilla, Prot Pallies were pretty hamstringed, and a full rebuild of how they managed threat would have done them favors no matter how you approached it. Take out the holy damage on block and the threat mechanic, reconstruct the tree with a real taunt and better way to build threat, and we'd have been stellar. Now, Retribution, the big offender. Almost everything in this tree has to do with dealing additional holy damage, or improving your judgments, or using the light to cripple or harm your enemies. All out. Write it all out, get rid of it. Sanctity Diara, Vengeance, which I will add as a terrible name for a paladin talent. Seal of Command, toss it in the trash, all of it. Two-handed spec, and oddly enough, I feel Repentance can stay. Repentance in particular is going to be divisive. And oddly enough, I actually really like it. Most people thought it was useless, but it had the right idea. Some tweaking and iteration, and I feel like the right kind of ability to keep around. Maybe not in the Retribution tree, but still keep it around. The question is then, what do we do with the Retribution tree? Throw out the name as well. So starting out, we're coming up with a new name, as Retribution and Vengeance should not be a part of what a jet paladin act. Call it the Marshal or the Judge tree, as both would be more fitting for their past and indicate this tree is about the physical prowess that paladins were best known for. Build the tree to support melee crit, buffing your group as you hit in certain ways or with certain abilities, or even giving the paladin enhancements to his physical prowess as he hits certain ability combos. This leans into the elephant in the room once again, though. We're doing another callback here. I said we'd come back to this. We need to cut out using the light as a weapon from paladins. How do we do that? Well, my big ideas are kind of what I alluded to with the retribution tree thoughts. Build the class's offensive abilities to focus on individual weapon swings, combo abilities, and momentum with their warhammers. Those things are big, heavy, and very effective when you use their mass to your advantage. Self-buffs and physical target debuffs are the way to go, I feel. Comboing buffs and debuffs on targets, forcing them to be off balance or knocking the wind out of them before following up with a big hammer smash. Additionally, short duration party buffs based on ability use would also be a stellar way to build group cohesion based on the leadership qualities the paladins embodied, especially during the Second War. I referenced this with a few different vanilla WoW subjects, but I think of the Captain class from Lord of the Rings Online. I feel it's a good reference to work off of with this. All this also begs the question, though. What if the differences between Warcraft 3 Paladins and World of Warcraft's Crusaders were done purposefully? It happened before with other subjects, and in those cases, shown to be well documented and reasonable. If they did want to change the way members of the Silver Hand were allowed to act, how they used their power, they could have made an awesome set of class quests as Paladins leveled, showing that, hey, we really gotta learn and grow. The world is changing, and we need to change with it. You don't even need to be that overt with it either. Keep it subtle if you want. Make it more about actually learning the skills and figuring out where the new boundaries need to be versus very strict change. There's so many ways change could have been shown and implemented, and it really felt like Blizzard never even tried in the first place with it. Moreover, and I think this question is really important, but how many paladins survived the Scourging of Lordaeron in the first place? We're pretty darn sure there weren't any left in Stromgarde, Alterac, Dalaran, or Gilneas, and while there could have been some in Stormwind, South Shore, or Nethergarde, would it have been enough to reform the Silver Hand in the first place? Sure, Stormwind had a Church of the Light, and there would have been at least a few paladins there, but a vast majority of the Order was in Lordaeron or out in Outland when the Dark Portal closed. Stratholme, the city obliterated by Arthas, was supposed to be the center of all Silver Hand operations, which means when the Scourge ramped up its operations, the Paladins of Lordaeron were already in extreme disarray and requesting help. Of those members of the Silver Hand that did survive, you have to assume either converted to the Scarlet Crusade, sold their souls to the Lich King and became Death Knights, or went into hiding like Tyrion Fordring. In the 4 years between Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft, did enough Paladins come together to reform the Order in a meaningful way, and if so, how? One could easily say that the Church of the Holy Light, with its reconstructed cathedral and center of power in Stormwind, had a serious hand in this, but they were dealing with the sudden death of their patriarch, Alonzus Fowl, and I doubt Benedictus, the man chosen to lead in replacement of Fowl, would have had the resources or the organization necessary to assist in reforming the Silver Hand virtually from scratch at the same time. 4 years may be a long time, but we're talking about reconstructing an entire religious knightly order when you're already dealing with multiple major crises. My point is, and I ask this question more as something to consider than an actual concern, but should we even have paladins in WoW in the first place? Food for thought on this one, listener. One should consider as many angles as possible. This was a long and involved one, and as I mentioned at the beginning, I expect most of you to disagree with me in some capacity. That's just fine. I expect it on this kind of subject, as I hold a relatively extreme opinion. However, I do hope, I opened you up a bit on thinking about how we approach classes in Warcraft, and maybe I got you thinking a bit about Paladins, or even your own favorite class and how they've been implemented. In a future episode, we'll talk about other religious orders and organizations, including the Scarlet Crusade and the Earthen Ring, and dive in just a bit deeper as to how these groups support themselves and what their goals are. We close this book of Warcraft history here and save the rest for another time. If you enjoyed this feature, please consider subscribing here at youtube.com/thedannation, as well as joining my Discord at tinyurl.com/danscord. It's a Discord, but with 100% more Dan. A big thank you to Turtle Wow, where most of the visual footage you see during this episode was recorded at, as well as having provided the backing track for this piece. An additional thank you to those that have signed up for memberships here on YouTube. Your financial support is greatly appreciated. From the Lore Bunker here in Boston, Massachusetts, this is Dan wishing you a wonderful and wide, wide world of lore.